We found a way to listen to the afterlife, and what we heard terrified us. I was working as an audio technician at the time. Mostly freelance, I did odd jobs for films, music artists, and even a few well-known podcasts. When I was approached by a company specializing in ARID, I initially thought they'd made a mistake. Their email was rather mysterious. We're looking for an experienced audio technician for one of our projects. We've listened to your samples, and your sound processing skills in particular seem to be exactly what we're looking for. Your participation will be remunerated up to $3,000 for 3 days of work. If you are interested, please reply within 48 hours. As the nature of this project is highly confidential, no information will be passed on to you about the nature of this project before you sign an ND. To avoid wasting my time with a hoax, I asked for a face-to-face meeting at their company headquarters. To my surprise, they immediately agreed, and the next day I had an appointment at their premises at 9:00 a.m. I announced myself at reception, and a woman in a white scientist's coat who introduced herself as Elizabeth invited me to accompany her to her office. After signing the NDA and my contract, she led me through a maze of corridors to where I would be working. You'll soon understand why we had you sign a confidentiality agreement. The research we do here is highly confidential, and we've already made a major discovery that just needs one last push, she said, turning to me with a smile. I hope I can help you in the way you expect, I said, still in the dark about the mission I was about to be given. We arrived in a spacious room already occupied by another man, also wearing a white coat, whom I assumed to be his superior because of the authoritative look in his eyes and his advanced age. Mr. Meltrin, I presume Darren Daylon, Chief Scientist, is delighted to have you with us. Please sit down. I sat down opposite them on a table that was empty, except for a strange object whose origin and function I couldn't account for. Mr. Meltran, I'm not going to beat about the bush. You're going to be involved in the most important project of your life for the next 3 days. Do you see this device? He asked, pointing to the object in the center of the table. This device is what I've been working on for the last 20 years of my life. You see, I've always been certain that there was life after death, and this device, I'm convinced, is what will enable me to prove it. I inspected the object more closely. At first glance, it didn't look much, about the size of a laptop and just under 12 inches high. It was entirely black, and only a circle like a loudspeaker in the center of the upwardly exposed face was visible. It was connected to a portable keyboard that sat right in front of the scientist. We can't reveal precisely how it works, but to put it simply, this device allows us to listen to frequencies that until now had never been reached. Frequencies that we are certain correspond to the beyond. You'll understand the problem we're facing, Elizabeth said, pressing a key on the keyboard in front of her, and looking at a screen I assumed was on the other side of the device. Instantly, a sound from elsewhere pierced my eardrums. The sound was unmistakably high-pitched and seemed static, despite the fact that I had the impression of hearing pitch variations without being able to distinguish them. Elizabeth finally cut the sound with a grimace, after pressing a few keys. Mr. Meltrin, we're not asking you to believe us about our discovery. All we're asking is that you work hard to analyze and filter this sound and turn it into something usable. I was circumspect, but they both seemed very serious. You really think there's something in that sound? What do you think it is? A silence fell, and Elizabeth looked at her superior, out of the corner of her eye without intervening. Yes, Mr. Mitran. We think there's something in the sound as you say. Your work begins today, and Elizabeth will show you the equipment at your disposal. I set to work. I was allowed to use all the equipment in the lab, computers and all, including the device in question, but I couldn't take anything home or work from home. Everything had to be done on site, and every second had to be recorded by cameras and microphones. I recorded a sample of the sound and started by trying to filter it. I'd already worked on sound that was cut, corrupted, of poor quality or whatever, and I used every technique I knew to try and clean it up. I spent the entirety of my first day on it, to no avail. The second day, I continued in this direction, not knowing what else to do. My attempts became more and more desperate. I honestly couldn't see how they expected me to get anything out of that uniform. Shrill sound. I decided to concentrate on my ears and listen to the sound produced by the device over and over again. There was definitely something strange about it. I don't know how to explain it, but the more I listened to it, the more my breathing quickened, as did my heart, and part of my brain screamed at me to end it, or run away, so much so that I was beginning to fear continuing to listen to it. After all, it was supposed to be a sound from beyond, according to them, although I wondered if this scientist hadn't just gone mad trying to find an answer to his obsession. The second day ended like the first. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound kept echoing in my head. It was as if, by listening to it over and over again, it had become imprinted on me. I had the impression of discovering new facets and new variations. It was as if the sound was still happening, but in my head, and I couldn't stop it. I turned over in bed for the 15th time and stared at the ceiling. And the vision that came to me stunned me. At first, I thought I was imagining shapes moving because of the darkness. But like the sound, the more I concentrated on what I was seeing, the clearer it became. There were dozens and dozens of faces, their horrified expressions distorting their features as they blended into the ceiling and seemed to be trying to break out, to extricate themselves from the solid matter. As the faces tried to push against the darkness to get out, I could hear the sound in my ears getting louder and louder, sharper and sharper. My heart was beating so fast that I was afraid it would suddenly stop. I could hardly breathe. They were there. They were coming out. And for some unknown reason, I was certain that if they reached me, they'd take me with them. With that thought, I jumped out of bed and, in 2 steps, reached the light switch in my room and looked up. There was nothing there. And the sound, though persistent, was a distant echo in my head. On the third and last day, I sat down at my workstation with dark circles under my eyes. I'd spent the rest of the night on my feet, trying to think of a solution. I approached the device again, and after a moment's hesitation, my instinct screaming at me not to press the key, I turned it on. Again, that shrill sound is so unique, flat and endless. That's when it hit me. I remembered the first impression I'd had when I heard it for the very first time. There was a feeling of missing something behind the uniform appearance of the sound. What if there were so many sounds that the mush coming out of them made them impossible to discern? I stood in front of my computer and spent the rest of the day isolating and slowing down the sound to an extreme level. It was 7 p.m., and I was finally ready to do a test. "The time you were given is almost at 0, she said with a compassionate smile. "I think I've found the solution. Are you ready?" Her eyes widened, and she sat down on a chair next to me in silence. I started the modified recording. I never imagined I'd hear what I heard. Screams. There are an incredible number of heartbreaking cries from an infinite number of people, men and women of all ages. Elizabeth's face turned pale, her gaze locked with mine, both her hands trembling slightly on her frail legs. The screams continued to fill the room, each passing second seeming to increase the pressure. I stopped the recording. My superior is going to want to hear this and apply it directly to the device to get a real-time translation. Can you do that? She seemed terrified by her own request, but like me, she didn't really have a choice. We had to go through with the project. Sure, Elizabeth, I should be able to do it in 10 minutes. Just give me a little time to grab something to eat and drink in the cafeteria, and I'll bring something back for you too. Despite the fact that the old chief scientist had heard the modified recording, he still asked me, as Elizabeth had planned, to apply the filter to the live sound. And when the device came on, indeed, we heard again the screams of what we assumed to be human beings. And it wasn't the same sound over and over again. It sounded like it was constantly changing. It was as if the sound itself was alive. The two scientists chatted quietly at the other end of the room and finally came back to me to congratulate me on my work. They both looked satisfied, but I sensed they were still in shock at the implications of all this. I told them that to finish, I just needed a little more time to refine the filtering and write down the method for them to follow once I'd gone. I spent the rest of the night working, and after a while, I realized that it was past midnight. I was just finishing tidying up my desk when suddenly the shouting stopped. That's when I realized that the device had been on all this time. I couldn't believe it. But I had to believe it, because now it wasn't the screams I was hearing, but the slow breathing and exhaling of someone or something. After a while, it said something in a language I didn't know, but which I assumed was something close to Latin. Then, nothing. I switched the machine off and on again, once, twice, and 10 times. Only a deafening silence and my jerky breathing filled the room. I explained what had happened before leaving. Fortunately for me, as it was all recorded, I had proof that I had nothing to reproach myself for, and they had a clear record of what the voice had said. I spent weeks trying to make sense of the sentence myself, but the more time passed, the more the words escaped me. After a while, I simply got on with my life, but the experience left an indelible mark on me. Even today, in the silence of the night, I sometimes feel as if I can hear a high-pitched tone echoing deep inside me. And I know that if I concentrate just a little bit on it, I'll hear again the horrific screams of that endless human tide. I've always been blind, and that's fine with me. I'm glad I never got to see, and then lost my sight. That would have been too depressing. Instead, I don't get to mourn something I've never had. I've lived in this Upper East Side flat for a really, really long time. As a writer, it's important for me to have my own space. I've been told my writing style is exquisite because I cannot see. I focus on the other senses, and my writing shines by stimulating them. I don't say a red apple. Red has no meaning for me. I say warm, firm, and sour. A bit sweet, fits in your hand, smells of grass and childhood. I'm not gonna lie. This flat was nice for a while, but really tiny, and I want to learn to play the piano. So naturally, since I've saved up a lot of money for my work, I bought this beautiful mansion in the suburbs. At least, that's how my friends and family call it. I don't care. I can't see anyway. I just needed to feel the warm sunlight in the kitchen and the crisp air from my balcony while I drink my coffee in the morning and listen to the birds. And I work, day and night. People thought it would be a problem if my house had an upper floor, because, according to them, even if I've lived my whole life blind and I cook, chop up things, take baths, and clean the house, I apparently can't climb some damn stairs. No problem for me. I counted the steps of my staircase. 14. Eventually, I got used to it, and I even stared at going up and down the stairs faster since I knew exactly how many steps I needed to climb. That's the thing when you're blind. Some movements become reflexes. Since you live alone, you learn how to position certain things, and you always find them in the same place. One day, however, I was going down the stairs, and I tripped. Where I expected the floor to be, there was this additional step, and I didn't think much of it. I figured I must have not paid attention. I mean, yes, it was odd, because after 30 years of being blind, tripping wasn't really a common thing, but I didn't look much into it. However, when I went up again, I tripped at the top. That was definitely unusual. Sure as it was, one extra step. I went back up the stairs and counted. 15. Counted again. The fuck? Sure enough, 14 steps. Whatever. I went to sleep. A few days passed, and I didn't trip anymore. Then, one night, as I went downstairs to get a glass of water, I tripped again. This time, I really fell down on my foot. That was not a skipped step. There were at least 2 additional steps. I felt around and stood up. My foot hurt a lot, but the ankle was good. I couldn't really stand up on it, but there was no serious damage. I went up, carefully counting. 16. What the fuck? Sure, you mess up. You count 1 more or 1 less. But 2 more. The house was so still and silent. No birds, no bees, and no cars passed. Normal people fear the darkness. I fear the silence. I went down the stairs again, counting. By the time I reached the bottom, I counted 14 again. I went up again, 18. That was absolutely ridiculous. Was someone messing with me? How could they even mess with me like that? I've never heard of a burglar breaking into someone's house and adding steps to their stairs. Still, I went to check to see if I had locked the door. I can make my way around pretty neatly. I went through the kitchen, then into the hallway. And then I bumped into something. I froze. My organs tensed up. My hair stood up in all ears. I had never felt so much fear in my life. I decided to go on and check the door. Yeah, locked. I made my way back upstairs, and this time I didn't bump into anything. Or anyone. 18. For fuck's sake. All night, all I did was go up and down like a lunatic. Each time, I got different results. Back upstairs, I decided to go down and make one final count. 14. Okay, it is probably going to be more. 15. Nope, still going. 17. 19. 21. That's a record. 27. 33. That could not be possible. 52. 88. I could absolutely feel this sense of impending doom. Something was there with me, and it was vile, disgusting, and unnatural, and the staircase was never ending. 102. I finally gave up. Whatever this was, I didn't want to reach the bottom. I went back up. The moment I turned my back to go up, I tried to be brave. But something got over me, and I ran on all fours, desperate to reach the top, desperate to reach the top, desperate to run. Run back to my bedroom. I don't remember how I got inside and locked my door, but I did. And now I'm sitting here and typing. This house is strange. It is eerie and disturbing, and I think if I'd gotten to the bottom of the staircase, I would have left this world. I don't think that was my house anymore. However, no matter what stupid, cryptic, eerie, unnatural staircase I unveiled, it is important not only that I don't go down there, but that nothing comes up either. And right now, I can hear it creaking. I was 25, and she was 23. We had been together for 6 or 8 months, depending on how you define together. At the time, I was living rent-free with my uncle and helping out at the pub that he owned at the edge of town. She, having moved to Prague about 6 months prior, was living in the center in an apartment that seemed nice at first, but turned out to be occupied by sociopaths. When the tensions among her roommates exploded in a drunken night of shattered glass, she took it as her cue to move out. Security deposit be damned. We met the summer prior on the edge of town. She was a Euro-tripping American looking to discover the authentic corners of Prague, and I was excited to practice my English with a native speaker and serve someone who wasn't a grumpy old man. Originally, she was meant to spend 3 days in Prague, then move on to Budapest, travel through the Balkans, and fly back home through Prague. After the first night we spent together, she decided to skip Budapest. By the end of the week, the Balkans were a purely theoretical place. When it was time for her to fly back home, she dawdled and almost missed her flight. It wasn't until we were sweaty and out of breath at the security check that she told me that she had decided to move to Prague. She didn't want to rush things with me, she said. Right after graduation, she had moved in with her high school boyfriend, and the blisters from that mistake were fresh. After 2 months of daily calls, emails, and photos, we ironed out the details of our relationship. We were taking things slow. When her roommate turned out to be a bottle-throwing maniac, we sped up a bit. We moved in together in the spring of 2014. That's the first time I saw the painting. I didn't pay much attention to the decor of the apartment when we first moved in. I was just happy to be with her. I was just happy to feel like an adult in a stable relationship. It wasn't until a lazy Sunday evening, when she fell asleep on the couch after we watched something streamable, that I noticed the painting. A lush field of wheat on a bright summer day. In the distance, there sat a humble little cottage. In the foreground, a father and his 3 children worked in the fields. They stood on their hind legs and worked at the wheat with human tools. But the creatures were mouse-like in their appearance. The painting didn't fit in with the rest of the modern apartment. Everything else came directly off the discount rack at IKEA, but the canvas that rested above our television was wholly original. Oil paint, detailed to an astounding degree. The mice in the field seemed to move ever so gently. I remember being taken by the painting for a while, trying to understand what it meant or how the artist had captured such lifelike motion. But then she started to gently snore on my shoulder, and I was far too in love to keep my attention steady. The painting would occasionally catch my eye while I was cooking or ironing clothes. Whenever we were watching streamables and the question of whether we should let the next episode play or go to sleep came up, I would find my eyes drifting to the mouse people, as if seeking their guidance. They seemed happy back then. The painting interested me, but back then it was just a passing interest. Life in the center took up most of my attention. I had gotten a new job, and that was somewhat stressful, but I was beyond ecstatic to get out of the cement shackles of the outskirts. The Art Nouveau, the bars, the concerts under my windows. My new address made me fall in love with the city in a way I didn't think possible. I got to see Prague from a whole new angle, and she was there with me to experience every last bit of it. A couple times, we talked about getting married to make the immigration process easier. It was usually meant in jest, but we still talked about it with straight faces. The first 6 months we spent in that small apartment were sheer bliss. But then, well, something went wrong. It could have been the product launch at work that nearly drove me into a nervous breakdown. It could have been that our honeymoon period was running out. It could have been that she was just getting tired of Prague. Either way, we found ourselves slowly becoming strangers to each other. This all happened nearly a decade ago, so you'll excuse me if I forget the details. I only vaguely remember the slow dread of drifting apart. The painting is what I remember with painful sharpness. It happened the first time I tried having a serious conversation about our future. That night, I asked a lot of questions and received a lot of sad shrugs in response. It was after one of those quiet stabs to the heart that I found my eyes wandering. Weren't there always 3 mouse kids? I remember asking. For a moment, her face lost its sadness and turned to confusion. On the painting, it was always the dad mouse and 3 kids, right? Now, there's only 2. It wasn't just the missing mouse, though. There seemed to be a shift in the skies of the painting. The wheat no longer shone with the golden hue of the summer sun. Storm clouds were gathering in the distance. The mouse people no longer seemed excited about their labor. And I was almost sure of it. One of them was missing. I don't know. I never paid attention to the painting. Sorry, she said. And then, with a sigh, she nudged the conversation back towards the topics neither of us wanted to discuss. We broke up about a week later. I moved back in with my uncle. She stayed in the apartment. Most of my stuff was still in the center, so about once a week, I would drop by to chip away at the sluggish task of moving via subway. I'd always go over when I knew she was at work, and I'd make my visits as swift as possible so as not to allow myself to wonder about how her life was going without me. After a month of my periodic relocation, all that was left in the apartment was a pot, 2 pans, and a paperback or two. I went to grab the rest of my things on Czechoslovakian Independence Day, finding a nice bit of irony in it. I was so satisfied with my dramatic scheduling that I completely forgot that she'd get the day off from work as well. To my surprise, she was in much better spirits than the last time we met. We got to talking about things unrelated to us, and then we picked up a bottle of white wine from the winery downstairs. After a couple hours, we grabbed a second. My books and pants stayed put that night. For the next couple of weeks, we relit whatever spark our relationship had lost. It was as if the past couple of months had been spliced out of the film reel of our lives. We went on trips out into the country together. We spent countless hours laughing and sharing the obscure details of our lives. The sex was as blissful as it was the summer we first met. Throughout our little post-breakup honeymoon, the painting stopped bothering me. It was still drawn with style and care, which defied all expectations, and there were still only 2 mouse children in the field. But the wheat shone with golden prosperity once more. We were happy. For a while, we started joking about getting married again. Yet, as is the tendency in post-breakup relationships, our moment passed. Like a Morse code call for help, our time together became punctuated by empty silence. Eventually, that plea descended into complete darkness on another night of slow and difficult conversations. As we sat on the couch and slowly shuffled towards the realization that we have no future together, I once again found my eyes drifting towards the painting. The hue of the fields turned cold once more. Off in the distance, by the cottage of the mouse people, I spotted a little clump of rocks and a cross that had not been there before. That night, our relationship breathed its last breath. That ending hurt. But it didn't hurt as much as the first one. Perhaps somewhere deep inside, I knew that we were not meant to last. Perhaps it was the strangeness of the painting that lessened the sting of the breakup. It all hurt, obviously. Yet as I rode my 2 a.m. Uber back to the outskirts with my collection of paperbacks and pants, I didn't think much of her. I thought about the mouse people. I thought about the little grave next to the cottage. I was certain it was never there before. I was certain the painting was changing in front of my eyes. We kept the radio silent for about a week. I retreated back to the outskirts and nursed my wounds among towers of cement. I had resolved to avoid the neighborhood in which she lived to keep the stitches around my heart from splitting, but soon enough that resolve proved to be pointless. Prague had turned sour for her. She was moving back to the States. There were still 6 months left on the contract for the apartment, and someone needed to replace her name. The last time we met, the change in the painting was undeniable. The warm summer sun was blotted out by dark storm clouds. The fields of wheat, which were once bountiful, grew sparse and diseased. The father and his 2 mouse children had ceased their labor and shed their smiles. The mouse people stood on the road leading to a broken-down cottage, their heads bowed in sorrow and their eyes void of hope. Her bags were already packed and sitting by the door. She was not interested in talking about the painting. She wasn't interested in talking at all. The changes in the art defied all reason and sent my mind down paths where it didn't belong. Briefly, I considered whether she was not changing out the pictures whenever I left the apartment. I asked. There was no motive for her to try to drive me insane, and that sort of malice would have been deeply uncharacteristic of her, but I still asked. She did not respond. She just looked at me as if I had turned into a complete stranger. We sat there in silence, our shared history slowly being wiped away by pain, until her Uber notification went off. I helped her with her suitcases. After an anemic hug, she got in the car. I never saw her again. The thought of the painting being a part of some bizarre prank didn't seem likely the day I asked it. By the end of the week, it had become unthinkable. The painting continued to grow darker and darker. The wheat turned sicklier by the day, and the attention of the mouse family slowly turned from their dying fields to the world beyond the painting. They stared at me. They started at me with their beady eyes full of sorrow, as if I were responsible for their suffering. They stared at me, and their stares brewed a deep guilt within my stomach. I wanted to remove the painting from the wall back then. But the breakup had sucked away all of my resolve. My diet started to consist wholly of ordered food, and I scarcely ever visited the living room or kitchen anymore. The painting was still in the back of my mind. I would still occasionally catch glimpses of its ever-worsening visage, yet life kept me busy enough for it to slowly fade from my attention. I had a job to focus on. I had a life to live. It wasn't until a season later that the painting took center stage of my attention again. I had attended the birthday party of an old high school classmate and befriended his cousin to the point where she wanted to visit my home after all the bars had shut. I was not prepared for visitors that night. My bedroom was a mess. My new friend would be unimpressed by my growing collection of takeout boxes around my bed. So, to prevent any feelings of repulsion, I settled down with her on the couch in the living room. For a while, things were going smoothly. My new friend and I had comfortably settled down and were drunkenly exploring each other's bodies. But then, with a discomforting suddenness, I felt her body tense under my hands. When I asked her what was wrong, she slowly nodded towards the painting. Even in the faint reflected light of the street lamps outside, you could see them. The tortured mouse family stood in the foreground of the painting. They all looked hungry. Very hungry. Very hungry. Yet the mouse children seemed to be balancing the edge between starvation and death. Their father had his skeletal arms around them, holding them upright. All three of them looked out to the world beyond the painting with hungry, sunken eyes, begging for deliverance from their suffering. To ease her discomfort, I took the painting off the wall and rested it face down in the hallway. That did not help. All the sex had dissipated from the room the moment she noticed the starving mouse folk. Soon enough, she was ordering an Uber back home. It was getting late, after all. When she was gone, I cleared the takeout boxes off my bed and tried to get some shut-eye. When my mind refused to calm, I mixed myself a nightcap. When even that didn't help, I gathered up all of the takeout boxes and took them out to the recyclables. Along with the countless greasy paper bags, I also disposed of the painting. I had hoped that getting the painting out of the house would calm me, but it didn't. Instead of going to sleep, I found myself hovering by the window, looking out at the containers. Even at a distance, I could sense the mouse folk looking at me. I could sense them blaming me for their suffering. The presence of the painting in my apartment had made me uncomfortable for months, but the sight of it in the trash somehow felt worse. The thought of it rotting in some landfill made me nauseous. The mouse folk were harrowing to look at, but I was certain that they were alive. They stared up into my window from the trash cans. They were pleading for help. I was responsible for them. With the sun starting to rise over Prague and a hangover slowly hatching behind my eyes, I left the house one final time. I didn't hang the painting back on the wall. Instead, I placed it in the closet, facing away from me. The thought of getting rid of the painting felt patently cruel, but I wasn't going to let it chase away guests again. When I woke in the late afternoon, my sheets were drenched in sweat, and my heart was pounding. I had terrible dreams that night. I dreamt in discomforting detail of the mouse folk. I stood with them in their barren fields. They reached out to me with trembling fingers eaten away at by hunger. They begged and pleaded with me in a soft language I could not comprehend. I stood in their broken world, and for a while, I feared that I would never be allowed to leave. The dream was discomfortingly vivid, and when I woke, it took me many breaths to find my bearing. Yet, once the terror of my sleep wore off, and I got some coffee in my system, the lazy Sunday evening soothed my spirit. Hidden in the closet, the painting stayed out of sight and out of mind. Whenever I was cleaning the apartment, I would see the back of the frame when retrieving the vacuum. I would never turn it around. I would never spare it a second look. I couldn't abide by the painting ending up in the trash, but the less I knew about it, the happier I was. The years passed. It took a while for me to shake off the heartbreak and the general discomfort the past year had instilled in me. But soon enough, the thoughts of my American affair, or the painting, slid away. I met another woman, a woman who would soon become my wife. We lived together in the apartment, and then our little family grew. Our daughter wasn't planned, but she was loved. Before she could walk, the humble pad in the city center suited us just fine, but as time wore on, it became clear that there were better places to raise a child. The air was smoky, the trams were loud, and the nearest park was too distant to be a daily attraction. Eventually, my family retreated from whence I came, back to the outskirts. We moved past the cement housing projects and into the quiet suburbia of family homes. Briefly, I considered leaving the painting behind, but it didn't feel right. Without checking if the canvas had changed, I threw a tarp over it and deposited it in our new attic. Hidden out of sight, the painting slipped my mind completely. For years and years, I completely forgot about my old relationship or the queer mousefolk. It wasn't until this morning that I found myself looking into those harrowed eyes again. I woke to a scream from the attic. I've told my daughter 100 times that she's not allowed to play up there, but she's never been a particularly obedient child. The moment I heard her, I rushed up the stairs as fast as I could. I had feared an injury, but the moment I saw the tarp on the floor, I knew something worse had happened. Over the years, the painting has continued to change. The fields had wilted into dead earth. The humble cottage in the distance was laid low into kindling. The mouse father held his children in his skeletal arms. Yet they no longer seemed alive. His tortured eyes stared out into the world, bloodshot and sunken and pleading. The mouse father looked at me. My daughter is still shaken. My wife insists the painting be thrown away immediately, but I can't bring myself to dispose of it. I can't bear the sight of the suffering mousefolk peeking out of a landfill. Something deep inside of me doesn't want to get rid of the painting. Its existence makes my skin crawl, but the idea of it being thrown out is significantly more unpalatable. There's a part of me that feels responsible for the mousefolk on the canvas, but now there's something significantly more disturbing that I see in the painting. One of the mouse children looks exactly like my daughter.